So that is really kind of the opening of my book after the education wars, but there are actually some happier anecdotes and chapters. And one of the ones that relatively few people are aware of is the experiment that took place in a district called Leander, Texas. Leander is a district outside of Austin. It started out in the 80s with about 2,500 students, so it was very small, and it has grown exponentially since then. The district is now almost the size of New Orleans. And it has grown partly because of demographics, lots of people moving to Texas and Austin in particular, but also because the district has come to be known as one of the best education districts in Texas. So how did that happen? Well, back in the 1980s, one of the key administrators at Leander discovered W. Edwards Deming. And of course, this was the man who I had written my first book on, back in the late 80s. And so it's important to know who Deming was. And he's unfortunately been largely forgotten. But back in the 1950s, after World War II, Deming became associated with what we now think of as Japanese quality management and the revival of Japanese industry. Fast forward to the 1980s, when the Japanese were beating the pants off of American manufacturers, the Detroit auto companies brought Deming to Detroit. And I remember vividly being in meetings, in lecture halls, etc., where Deming was a very tall, imposing man. He was about 6'5" and very large. Would peer down at CEOs and senior management, and he says, "The problem with American industry is senior management." Okay? And he was squarely putting the responsibility for all that ailed American industry on top executives and CEOs in particular. Well, what is surprising about this? Well, the traditional mantra was that the problem with the American industry was, first of all, unions, and secondly, sort of lazy, ne'er-do-well workers. Okay, and Deming completely flipped the script. Now, why did he do that, and how did he kind of come to this realization, if you will? Well, Deming was a statistician and a physicist by training, and he was a systems thinker. And his argument was that, especially in large, complex organizations, the only people who really can control the system is top management. Now, in order to affect meaningful change and improvement, senior management has to figure out sort of what's wrong with the system and how they can improve it. Well, the only way they can do that is if they can harness the knowledge of rank and file employees who are closest to the system, train them to recognize what the systemic problems are, and create an environment in which they feel comfortable and empowered to relay that information. Okay? So it's a very bottoms-up, collaborative philosophy of management. And it's also very, very powerful. So take back to Leander. Senior administrators watch a video about the transformation that takes place in Detroit after some of Deming's ideas are adopted. And they think, well, this might work for us. And so they start gradually to institute a number of changes. Now, mind you, they start small. It's 2,500 people, 2,500 students. They start with lots of training, especially for senior administrators. They start working on culture. And what emerges at Leander is a school district which now has many, many schools, and as I said, something like 50 to 60,000 students. What emerges at Leander is a culture of continuous improvement, where teachers undergo, lots of training, where new teachers come into the district and their first 2 days on the job they spend at Culture Day, where the superintendent and Leander also benefited, the whole experiment benefited from the fact that over 30 years they only had 2 superintendents, so there was lots of consistency. And the most recent superintendent was there for about 20 years. He was a former drama teacher, so he brought lots of theatrical verve to Culture Day. And Culture Day was fun. There would be lots of talks about what the Leander culture was. There would be games. There would be movies. And just as one example, before lunch, very typically at Culture Day, they would show a short skit from one of Lucille Ball's TV shows. And you all may recall that there was a wonderful sketch of Lucy and her friend Ethel working on an assembly line, where they were wrapping, their job was to wrap chocolates. And they're standing there happily wrapping chocolates, and the assembly line is moseying along with the chocolates, and they're doing their job. And Lucy turns to Ethel and says, gee, this is kind of fun, and it's not so difficult, and I can do this. And suddenly the assembly line starts to speed up, and they're like really scrambling to wrap the chocolates. And then the supervisor walks in and says, if a single piece of chocolate goes unwrapped, you're fired. And the assembly line keeps speeding up, and they're shoving chocolates under their caps and into their aprons, and chaos ensues. Okay, so in this one 10-minute sketch, Leander's emphasizing that the assembly line and the supervisor are the system, and if that is out of control, there's no way that the employees can do their jobs, right? So after the Lucy and Ethel sketch, there's usually a lunch break, and I got an opportunity to speak to a lot of these new teachers who had just been hired at Leander. And incidentally, this was a period when there were huge teacher shortages in Texas. Okay, I mean, there were lots of reasons why, but they were really having a hiring problem in Texas, but not at Leander. Leander had its pick of teachers. And the reaction to Culture Day, to a superintendent who took 2 days to introduce them to the district culture, to a culture that sought to promote an inclusive approach to improving education. Okay, that was sought to create an environment that made it possible for teachers to do their best work. Okay, that was just incredibly impressive to these teachers. They said, I'm pinching myself that I'm here. I'd heard so much about Leander, and it's better than anything I could have imagined. Okay, and very importantly, there were lots of these cultural elements introduced at Leander, but very importantly, none of it was mandated. Okay, so yes, there were a lot of trainings. Yes, they had a fair every year where teachers could showcase the improvement projects that they were working on with their students, by the way, because this included the students. But no one had to participate. Okay, so there were no mandates. And just one other very important thing about Leander and what this culture was like. In the 1990s, when Governor Ann Richards brought in a fairly progressive superintendent, he said to the districts in Texas, if there's anything that we are requiring of you that is getting in the way of your doing a better job, let us know and ask for an exemption. So Leander took them at their word, and they asked for an exemption from what? From the punitive teacher evaluations that were required in Texas. Punitive teacher evaluations pegged to test scores. And they won the exemption, and they kept reapplying. And so for years, Leander was one of the only districts that did not have punitive teacher evaluations. And why was this the one exemption that they applied for? Because they felt that interfered with this culture of bottom-up collaborative improvement. So really a very powerful story. I don't have time right now to, I think, to talk about another chapter that I think is very important, which is what happened in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Diane Ravitch has called it one of the best records of what happened in New Orleans, but I do just want to say that that was the apotheosis of top-down, business-minded, business-driven reform. What you had in New Orleans was that, of course, the public school system was effectively shut down. The teachers, the unionized teachers, most of whom were black, middle-aged women, were fired. And what was introduced instead was the first all-charter school system in the country. And charter schools are supposed to be about choice, but actually most of the charter schools practiced a brand of no excuses, strict discipline pedagogy. And KIPP is the primary model of that. And incidentally, that's a model that actually works for a number of children, but it doesn't work for many others. And what happened in New Orleans was, to paraphrase Henry Ford, you could have your choice of schools as long as they were strict discipline, no excuses schools. So what happened in New Orleans, I think, is an excellent example of this business-minded approach gone awry, experimentation with poor, traumatized, mostly black kids, and I think it's well worth a look, but that may be for another video.